Welcome to Let's Lime.
Let's Lime is a fresh collaboration between NFJC and the Cardio Nerds.
LIME stands for Leadership and Innovation in Medicine and Education.
To lime also means to hang out with your friends.
We sit down with some of today's visionaries in medicine to talk leadership, education, drive, and more.
We are your hosts, Caitlin Blashart and Justin Burke.
All right, let's lime.
Welcome to the fourth episode of Let's Lime. Let's Lime is a joint initiative between members of the Cardio Nerds Academy and the Nephrology Social Media Collective. We sit down with some of today's top influencers in medicine and education to learn about how and why they do what they do. I'm Caitlin Blashart, and my co-host is Gerline Kaur. I'll turn it over now to Gerline to introduce our guest.
I'd now like to welcome our guest for today, Dr. Alin Gragossian. Dr. Alin Gragossian is a critical care fellow at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York City. She completed her residency in emergency medicine. She's a heart transplant recipient and has shared her experiences of being both a patient and physician on several social media platforms, as well as writing about her journey in her blog titled A Change of Heart. Through her social media presence, she's been a strong advocate for raising awareness about organ transplantation, and we're so grateful to have her here with us tonight. And with that, I'll turn it over to Caitlin to get us started with our first question.
So I thought I'd just start by asking, so you've chronicled over the past several years some pretty major life events on Twitter, your blog, as Gerline mentioned, various other outlets. I was wondering, to kick us off, if you'd mind providing just kind of a synopsis of, or as much as you'd like to share about your journey to get us started for those listening in.
Sure. So my story basically, I guess, a little bit of my background. So I'm from Los Angeles. I did my medical school in Tennessee, kind of like migrated all over the United States. And then I was doing my emergency medicine training in Philadelphia. And I was always interested in going into academia. And I wanted to really, I had always wanted to do critical care and emergency medicine since, fourth year of med school is kind of what I had decided I wanted to do. So my emergency medicine training was geared towards, applying to fellowship and kind of getting everything ready for that. Since I was younger, I always wanted to live in New York City. And I know that sounds very cliche, and coming from LA, it's very weird, but that was always one of my things as well. So I wanted to live in New York. I wanted to do this emergency medicine and critical care training, and wanted to see where life would take me. In 2018, this was fall, winter of 2018, I had just applied to all my critical care fellowships. I had actually just matched into the critical care fellowship that I'm in right now, so Mount Sinai. And I was just about to finish my residency, completely healthy, no medical problems, doing really well. I had actually just gotten published in Resuscitation, which is kind of a big deal, for anybody who wants to go into critical care. And I had been doing so many things academically and, socially, everything was going well, and I was about to move to New York City. So I like to tell people that I was kind of in the prime of my life at 30 years old, thinking that nothing bad could ever happen to me. And right around that same time, right after my interviews were done, or right maybe just around the interviews were going on, I developed what I thought was a cold, or was probably a cold. And the cold just it kind of went away, but this cough persisted after that cold. And after maybe 4 or 5 weeks, so throughout November, beginning of December, that cough, it would intermittently come and go. And then the cough just worsened into basically shortness of breath, which obviously is a bad sign. And we know that in emergency medicine. I like to tell people that it was my own attending who had noticed, my ICU attending, who told me, you're short of breath when you're talking to me, and when you're, presenting patients to me in the ICU, you're actually stopping to take deep breaths. And have you noticed that about yourself in the last day or two? And I said, no, I feel fine otherwise. And then that same night, a few weird things had happened. I remember there were a couple of codes on the floors, and as the ICU residents, we were supposed to do all the codes on the floors. And normally I would take the stairs up and down just to get some exercise in while you're at the hospital, which is something a lot of residents do. But that night I couldn't, I had to take the elevator, which was really weird. And then also looking back, one of the other things was I was very tired during those days. and I was drinking like a lot of caffeine, which normally I'm not somebody who even needs coffee. And I was drinking like 2, 3, 4 Red Bulls a day. So that was like a big red flag. So putting all that together, I started feeling really crappy. And then the following day, a couple days later, I ended up in my own emergency department where all my attendings were there, and they had just seen me a couple days before that. So I looked terrible. From what they tell me, I looked terrible. My lips were blue. I was very pale. I was breathing like 40, 50. My heart rate was really high. And then we got a chest x-ray done. The chest x-ray basically showed these bilateral pleural effusions, which could kind of be anything. I thought maybe a pneumonia. We're not really sure. I was going to be admitted for like a further workup. And luckily I got admitted because that night I actually, as I was admitted a few hours later, while I was on the floors, I essentially became pulseless and I went into profound cardiogenic shock. I don't remember anything from that night. I just know that they had to resuscitate me, intubate me, take me to the ICU, do a bunch of things. Long story short, by the time I woke up intubated and in the ICU, they had told me, they had taken me to cath lab and all that, obviously, but they had told me my ejection fraction was 5% and my cardiac index was 1.1. I had like biventricular failure and I was going to need some sort of support. And like just 2-3 days before that, I was a normal resident, getting ready to move to New York City. So I had to eventually get transferred to University of Pennsylvania because that was the transplant center that I ended up going to. And I remember initially they said, you have to go somewhere with like advanced heart failure therapies. And I don't think I even processed what that meant. Like, I know what that means as a doctor, but I was like, what do you mean? And I was like, I just need some milrinone for a couple of days and I'll be fine. Like, it's probably just myocarditis. What ended up happening was it was familial dilated cardiomyopathy. I actually ended up doing the genetics, and it was something me and my dad have. And yeah, the rest is history. I ended up getting on the urgent heart transplant list. I got a heart transplant within 11 days, which is insane. I got the surgery done. And 9 days later, I was discharged. So within 3 weeks of my life, everything changed. After that, I went home. I celebrated my 31st birthday just a few days after that. And then the rest is history. Like, I went back to residency. I started my fellowship. Obviously a lot of stuff happened in the middle, but the rest is history. I tried to take that story and kind of do what I could with it. And here I am today.
Yeah, it's really inspiring to hear your story about how you went through so much and were right back into residency, fellowship, and training. And I know I was reading that you started your blog on just post-op day 7, and going through and reading it, it's provided such a vivid view of your experiences. And I think it's really allowed like people reading it like myself to learn about your journey and your personal reflections. I was curious whether writing has always been a creative outlet for you and what role the blog played in your ability to process everything that occurred around you and how you reflected based on the blog.
I've always liked writing. And I remember like during those times, I've always liked writing. So it's always something that I've done. But I feel like I started doing it more as I had all these things to process. And I definitely encourage it with other people as well. It doesn't necessarily have to be writing. Some people do other things. They draw, but they have to process their emotions and what they're going through in a certain way. And that just happened to be my outlet at that time. And still is. I still, write as much as I could. It's really difficult with like these 80-hour work weeks, but yeah, it wasn't necessarily new, but I started doing it more as I went through all of that.
So as we mentioned earlier, Gerline and I are both internal medicine residents, and we're just, I guess, starting to figure out what it means to be good physicians early in our training. Having gone through, as you put it in other podcasts, both to medical school and to patient school, I was wondering what you consider to be the qualities of a good physician from your experiences.
So I think being a good physician is really just, I know this sounds very cliche. I don't think you need to go through what I went through to be a good physician. I know a lot of people say that. They're like, you're probably such a better physician, because I'm like, no, you don't have to have like a cardiac arrest to know, to be a better doctor. But there are ways that I kind of empathize differently, and I kind of know what patients are going through, but at the same time, that doesn't mean I can't teach other people or I can't like tell other people what it feels like. So as much as I can, I tell, my co-fellows or people that I work with my opinions on certain things, or like, if a patient wants this, I try to advocate when I can. Not that other physicians can't. It's just something that I could do, and I tell other physicians and nurses that they can also do that. I do think that in general, trying really hard to listen to what the patient needs is really important. I know that sounds really cliche and it's something that we try to do, but unfortunately, it's not something that we always do. Being at the bedside means actually being at the bedside and listening to what the little things are. Sometimes it's just like an ear, it doesn't necessarily have to be like medicine. And so understanding what the patient needs, taking into consideration that it's not necessarily always something that has to do with like a physical ailment, getting them the support that they need. I think that's what makes a good physician.
Going off of it, I know in other talks and your blog, you've mentioned that at times your hospitalization and your diagnosis were more heartbreaking for your family and the people that were around you. So how did that experience change and shape your approach to how you approach conversations with family members of patients that you've taken care of as a critical care physician?
I do think this was harder on my family than it was on me. And there's a part of me that I'm not sure if that's because I'm in the medical field or if it's because just as a patient, it's not as bad as it is on the family. But I do find myself telling family members that, and they really appreciate it. Like in the ICU, when there's family members who are there for their really sick patients, or their really sick family members who are our patients, I acknowledge how difficult it is for them. I thank them for being there. And unfortunately right now, like we can't have a lot of visitors, but when they are there, I do tell them that it's important for them to be there. It's important for them to talk to the patients, even when they're intubated and sedated, it doesn't matter. And I acknowledge how difficult it is for them. And them just knowing that and somebody acknowledging to them that it's just as difficult for them as it is for the patient, if not more, is really life-changing. Like sometimes they're like, nobody's ever told me that. And I tell them like, no, sometimes I tell people my story, sometimes I don't. But, sometimes the time comes when I tell them, I went through something similar. My parents were crying every single day. I mean, every single day when I was hospitalized. So I remember those days. So I know what it feels like.
On a related note, I'll take one of the audience questions now from Tommy Das. So first he says, thanks for sharing your story. And his question relates to what your experience was like when you were in the ICU. Sometimes there's an element of depersonalization when we care for critically ill patients, especially relating to the language used in the patient room. What was your experience like, and how has that experience not only changed your care and also how you teach others to care for patients?
Again, this one's a hard one for me because I'm a doctor patient. So for me, it's always going to be different when your patient is a doctor. Everything they were saying, I basically understood. And I actually wanted to be just, I like just knowing the plan. I didn't want any BS. I just, they would come in and examine me. And so it was kind of different for me. And I wanted for them to just talk to me like I was a doctor at times, which was nice. But there was one thing, and it was communication between the teams. And it's not necessarily like one hospital does this, we all do this. So I think my parents kept saying like, why is the ICU saying that you're stable, but like the cardiology team is saying that you still need a heart transplant? And why is the surgical team saying this? And why? But they didn't understand that like every team has their own goal. So I was trying to tell them like, that's because for the ICU, what they care about is that like, I didn't die overnight. For the ICU, as long as my vitals are fine, like I'm fine. For the heart failure team, what matters is that my heart is still failing and I still need a heart transplant. For surgery, what matters is that I'm optimized for surgery. So everybody has a different goal. And I don't think patient families and patients fully, and now, going back to work after and realizing that, I don't think that's clear enough, because sometimes they'll be like, well, the other doctor said this, the other doctor said this. So there are ways that we can improve communication between teams and communicating what even our goal is. Sometimes we don't do that. So I think we can improve that.
Yeah, I think what you're mentioning is really insightful and valuable for us as physicians going forward when we take care of patients, to remember how it feels for the patient and their families. Kind of switching gears a little bit, about you found a sense of community, seems like through social media and organizations that you've connected with other transplant recipients with. How has that shaped your journey as both a patient and a physician, that sense of community?
It's been really nice. In the beginning, I remember when I first got out, I didn't, so like, I was a 30-year-old heart transplant patient, and there aren't that many heart transplant patients, let alone like 30-year-olds who have heart transplants. So it was really hard for me to find like a community where I could have talked to my doctors, but even that was going to be different. Like I wanted to know specific things, and I wanted to have like a girlfriend group who, we were all around the same age. We all had the same issues, dating issues, things like that. So what ended up happening was I went on social media. I went on, I think it was Instagram initially, and I just like searched for the hashtag heart transplant or something like that. And through that, I met, in the beginning, I think it was just like 4 or 5 of us. And we made like a group chat, and it became a bigger community after that. But it was really nice getting to know all the other women around my age, all around the world. There was one girl in Lithuania, one in England, a couple were in LA. So we ended up connecting, and it was just nice to be able to kind of vent to them what we were all going through. And it was really nice because all of us were, women around the same age who had recently been transplanted. So either like in the last 2-3 years. And then there were some who had been transplanted since they were like kids. So they were, they had congenital heart disease and had been transplanted when they were like 1. And so they were on like their 2nd transplant or whatever. So it was just nice having that community. I ended up doing the same thing with physicians. Like there's a whole community of physicians who have transplants. And I got to know quite a few of them. So having these little groups and having these communities to talk to, or these little like, for now, it's like group chats or groups, or, I've even met up with a couple of them, which is really cool. It's just nice to know that there's other people like you, and it doesn't have to necessarily be like your doctor. And, my doctors are awesome, but sometimes you just want other patients who are like you.
And it sounds like you connected with another physician and started up a podcast that I guess you announced last week, someone else who has a heart transplant. So I was wondering if you could tell us sort of about that endeavor and what your vision is for that podcast.
Yeah, so actually Kobe Salerno was one of the first people that I got in touch with. I don't remember, I think it was through Twitter, but he had gotten his heart transplant like 10 years ago. So his story was a little bit different than mine. So I was like never sick, acutely ill during training, and then like a patient, but he had actually been sick his whole life, and he had hypertrophic cardiomyopathy as a teenager. So he got a transplant in his early 20s. That's what made him want to go to med school and become a cardiologist. So we both had different journeys, but ultimately the same thing happened to us with transplant. And so when we started talking, like at this point, 2.5 years ago, we were always like, we should do a podcast. We should do a podcast. So that's been in the making for, at this point, like 2 years. And we just like, we're both fellows. Like I'm of all fellows, he's cardiology and I'm critical care. So we're like, we're just busy all the time. But we finally decided that we should really do it. A lot of people are asking us questions all the time. And we were like, it'll be cool if we do this. And, we've been friends for such a long time. He's like my brother. So we got to know each other. He's been, the number one person that I go to with all my questions regarding transplant since the beginning. And regarding like life in general, like what do you do when you have a COVID patient? Do you ask your like program director to do this? So it's just nice to have that bond.
And what do you plan to sort of talk about on the podcast? Is it going to be focused sort of on your experiences through transplant, or just sort of probably a mix of several things, I just imagine?
We're going to do a mix. So we have like episode ideas for the first few. So we're going to do stuff about transplant, including like vaccines, and like we're actually going to do episodes about each other and like other transplant recipients, and then we're going to actually have guests on the show. So it's mostly going to be interviews about the transplant community, but also like, he's really into cardiology, so we're going to do a lot of heart, cardiologists, heart failure cardiologists specifically, and then people from the transplant community, transplant pharmacy, and then we're going to do a lot of patient advocacy, and then talk about what we can from our like patient doctor connection, I guess.
Looking forward to listening to that.
Thank you.
We have a question from one of our participants in the audience, Tiffany Casa. She's asking, did you, based on your experiences and everything you went through, did that lead you to become mission driven? The feeling that you're here for a reason and have to fulfill a purpose? And if so, did that lead to your transplant advocacy and all the work that you're doing associated with that? And does that ever lead to burnout?
I'm not I'm not really one of those, I guess that sounds kind of weird. I'm not one of those people who's like, we are definitely all here for a reason. Like we have to find meaning. Like I'm not one of those people, but I do think that everything that I went through helped shape kind of the rest of my future, which is interesting. I don't think there was this thing that like suddenly happened to me and it enlightened me to but I do think that what happened to me, I can use, and add on to what I had already learned and was doing as a physician, which is why I continued to do what I was doing. I tried to add on what I learned as a patient and still continued with my goals in life. But I think it was nice because it kind of made me want to, with burnout, I think it actually made me want to go back to work even more now that I knew like this new side of medicine. And, it has its challenges being in clinical medicine, but at the same time, it's kind of nice knowing both sides, or it was nice, going back and knowing like this different side to medicine. So yeah, I mean, I don't think this happened to me for a reason, but because it happened to me, I'm using it as a reason to go on, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think I understand what you're saying there. And on, I guess, a related note, I was listening to when you appeared recently on the Parallax podcast, and you're talking about how you've since been involved in a lot of advocacy projects, working with different organizations relating to organ donation, including projects with the family, I guess, of the women whose heart you have. And I was wondering if you could tell us about some of the advocacy side and both kind of what you're working on and what work needs to be done in that space, you think.
So when I found out, so a little bit about like how a lot of people ask this, like, hey, can you find out about your donor? The way you can, it's really complicated. Some countries you can, some countries you can. Some regions is different than other regions. But basically in the beginning, let's say like the first 6 months to a year, you can have some closed communication. It's through the OPO, or the Organ Procurement Organization, and through social work of the hospital. But everything has to be through physical written letters, and everything has to be de-identified. So there's certain things you can and can't say through the letter. I don't even think I knew her name. You can't say like your profession. There's a lot of things. Anything that's going to identify you, you basically can't write in the letter. And you also aren't technically like allowed to search for people on social media and all that. So it's very, very strict on what you can and can't do. So in the beginning, and then of course, it's up to the donor's family if they want to open up communication. It's not up to the recipient. So if the donor wants to open up communication, they will tell the OPO asks you, and then you can decide. So I had, written a letter, and Lucy was her name. So Lucy's mom had written a letter, and the whole family had, signed it. And then it just so happened that they had wanted to open up communication. So for the first year, I think we had communicated a couple of times through the Organ Procurement Organization, Gift of Life. And then after the second year, you can actually like broaden communication and actually start like emailing or, meeting or whatever it is. But you have to sign some disclosure forms. So by the second year, that's when she asked if you want to get to know each other more and give phone numbers and all that. And I was okay with it. But, at that, I still didn't know her and her family that well. So it was interesting that as soon as we started like talking, and again, we haven't met in real life yet, but, we text all the time, we talk all the time. It was really interesting because I found out that as much as of work that I had been doing about organ donation on my side, like they had been doing just as much on their side, which was like awesome to find out about. And like, we didn't know each other. We didn't know that we were both became like very passionate about it. So, they had been doing like different charity events and, like registrations through Lucy's name and like all these amazing things. So, me and her had gotten together, we do some social media stuff. Anytime there's like, for example, if there's like donor sign up day, her mom will make a registration form in her name and then she'll send it to me and I'll send it to all my friends, things like that. But, once COVID is over, I would love to actually do like a real life event with her, which would be awesome.
Talking a little bit more about organ transplantation, what do you think are some challenges that still need to be tackled in the field of organ donation, and how can we individually and collectively as the medical community assist in those efforts?
So obviously there's an organ shortage. there's about 17 people per day who die waiting on the organ transplant list. And right now, I think I actually looked this up today, right now it's 107,000 people waiting for organ transplants, the most common being the kidney. People wait years just waiting for a kidney transplant. So it's really important, especially, you know, now that I've become a solid organ transplant recipient, I feel like I can use my voice as a physician and an organ transplant recipient to kind of get the word out there on how important it is to sign up to become an organ donor. So it's very easy to sign up. You just have to go to registerme.org and you sign up, or you can just do it through your iPhone health app. You just open it up and go to like edit on your name and it's right there. So it's very quick. It takes like a minute to do it. And you can save up to 8 lives just by signing up. So I always tell people that.
And just further on that, I was wondering sort of what your approach is to talking to people about organ transplant and signing up. Is it just sort of telling them like the steps and sort of it's this easy, or is there some type of contextualizing all of this that you usually go through with them? Or
I never like to, in general, this is my kind of view in medicine. When people are hesitant about doing something, you're not going to change their mind unless you find out why. And there's a lot of people you're not going to change their mind, so there's no point in trying. So there's gonna be a few right in the middle, like they're hesitant, they might, and those are the people you have to find. So I ask them like, what is the reason why aren't you signing up? And some people aren't even ready for that conversation, so that's fine. I don't push things, but if they're ready to talk about it, then they'll tell me, I heard that a lot of times it's, I heard that doctors don't resuscitate you when they find out you're an organ donor. And I'm like, well, it just so happens that I'm actually an ER doctor, and I can tell you that that is absolutely not true. Like, first of all, that's unethical. So like, besides that point, if you're worried about, there being somebody who was doing that, doctors don't even know who's an organ donor and who's not. So it's absolutely not something, like, it's not something you look at when a patient is coming in coding. It's not even something that you're thinking about. So, you get resuscitated. And so, for example, that's an example I'm giving. But a lot of times me just telling my story is enough for people to be like, wow, I didn't even know that. I didn't even know it could, save a life. I didn't even know that was a big deal. And then the other thing that people don't realize, because they're like, well, there's so many people who've already signed up. And I'm like, yeah, but like less than 5% of people, there's actually more of a chance of you actually needing an organ transplant than actually becoming an organ donor. So even though you're an organ donor, it's very difficult to be put under the circumstances where you actually become an organ donor, if that makes sense. So yeah, these are like very interesting facts that people don't realize.
Yeah, and I was speaking to someone recently that, some other misconceptions, like someone thought that an organ only lasts like a short period of time, and that it wasn't really like a life-saving treatment, not realizing how much the fields have evolved and how these organs can last for years and years and clearly change lives. So and Tiffany's put in the chat the link that you're just saying, registerme.org. The Canadian equivalent is beadonor.ca. That's where I am up in Canada, but logged on yesterday. It was very simple to get registered. So
awesome. Thank you.
I was recently listening to one of your podcasts that you did, I think shortly after your transplant. It was on Explore the Space with Dr. Mark Shapiro.
Right,
and
that
you
was
were describing
one.
Yeah, and you were describing everything that kind of happened from your initial days to how the transplant worked and everything. And I know from reading your blog, it seems like a lot has happened since then. So I was wondering if you feel comfortable sharing a little bit about your journey since the transplant and how your ability to understand what's going on and kind of how your mindset has evolved throughout all the different things that have come up.
Sure. Yeah, there have been a few things that have happened, interestingly. So overall, the transplant, everything has gone well. There was like an episode of rejection, which I tell people could happen. And, you end up requiring steroids for it. And so, I had been put on steroids a lot. And so, and of course, transplant itself, you're on a lot of medications, especially in the beginning. And so, you have different side effects from the medications. But one of the things the steroids did was I had avascular necrosis of both my hip joints. So like as soon as I started fellowship during this pandemic in July, I was diagnosed with bilateral AVN of my hip joints. So it was crazy, but I had to actually get both my hips replaced in a matter of like 4 months during fellowship, which, having been through like a heart transplant surgery isn't that bad. Like and actually my boyfriend is an orthopedic surgeon, so it makes it much easier. Like I knew a lot about it going in, and I had like the best help I could possibly have. So I know this sound like it wasn't that, like it was really nothing, but I guess it was something because it was, hip replacements. So that was one thing I had to go through, and that was hard. And then a lot of people always ask me about the medications, and medications in the beginning, I was taking, I think like 32 medications a day. And now it's just like 5 or something like that. And so, things get easier throughout the years, but you just have to be on top of your stuff. And again, it's not impossible to lead a normal life. It's just, you have to be willing to, you have to be okay with the consequences of some things. You have to be prepared, and you have to be on top of everything. And if you can do those 3, then you can lead a pretty normal life, which I feel like as a physician, I feel like someone in the healthcare profession in general, like we're type A and we're able to do those things. So of course it's difficult, but it's not impossible.
We've had a few people ask sort of related questions around, having sort of a few setbacks and a few kind of challenges on top of just regular residency fellowship. Has it ever made you consider leaving or changing kind of from your dream career path, and ever considering doing something different at all?
No, I still definitely want to finish fellowship. So before residency and fellowship, I had always wanted to do residency and fellowship, but I did want to do like academics. So I still want to do that, but I don't know what my focus is still. So I don't think I would do like full-time clinical medicine, but that wouldn't be because of my medical stuff. I don't think, at least. We'll see. But that's why I wanted to at least finish my residency and fellowship, to show people like, hey, it's totally possible. You're not going to have to put your goals back because of something you went through. Now, there are people who do, and that's totally fine. I do think that it's not something everybody could do. And it just so happens that most things went okay for me. And I was able to do everything and, get through everything, and that was fine. And it didn't change my mind on what I wanted to do in the future. But for some people it does, and that's okay too. I definitely let people know that. Like, it doesn't mean you have to go and like finish everything, for sure. You do start, setting your priorities differently, because of course you do think about all these different things that now you have to deal with the heart transplant patient, including like, for example, like my day, I work all the time, and then on my day off, I am at a clinic appointment. And so people were like, are you going to moonlight this year? And I'm like, no, why would I do that? Like, my one day off, you want me to work more? Like, no, of course I'm not going to do that. So there's things where I don't do now because of all the extra stuff that I'm doing because of my health. But yeah, so there are things you consider differently, but everybody's different.
I remember reading one of your blog posts when you were talking about, as the pandemic was starting, that you were wearing a mask 1 year before the pandemic hit, and that was kind of something you were used to. So I was curious about how you've kind of faced COVID and the challenges that have come across with the pandemic, and how you've advocated for mask wearing and other things that have been important for you even before COVID.
Yeah, of course. So as a transplant patient, I don't know if your patients do this or if most patients do this, but I was told, at least in the beginning of transplant, when you're hyperimmunocompromised, you still wear a mask everywhere. So the first 3 months of transplant, I was actually quarantined. I just stayed home most of the time. And then when I started working again, I was wearing a mask. Obviously, I was wearing an N95 in the hospital all the time. So like, that was not new for me. And when I was out in public places, so like using the subway in Philadelphia or like at the grocery store, I was just wearing a regular mask. So basically, like, everything that happened during COVID was like, as COVID started, I was kind of already pretty much doing all this stuff that we started doing because of COVID. Maybe a little more strict for COVID, but in general, like, I tried to remind at least immunocompromised patients and solid organ transplant patients that, like, we're used to this, like, we got this, don't worry. Now patients who are immunocompetent, I think it was a little more difficult to learn and to get used to masking up. But, I, at one point in my life, the year before, like wasn't masking up all the time, and I got used to it. It was difficult, but it's something that you're able to do. So I tell people like it was much better than the alternative, which was death. Like, I was told I can inhale anything and die because, I'm so immunocompromised, I can basically get any kind of infection. So I don't know. I think me wearing, I hope at least that when I wore a mask and I reminded people that like it's something that we're used to, hopefully that helped people.
I have to say, I really enjoyed preparing for this episode. I was listening to you on all kinds of podcasts, reading, and I really found sort of your approach and your view about things that you've been through quite refreshing and really honestly, personally helpful to me, reframing some things that have going on in my life and wondering how sort of you balance the view of clearly anything can happen to anyone at any time with sort of living kind of to your fullest and not living with anxiety about what the future could hold.
Yeah, I don't know if like you're born like that or if it was something that I picked up throughout the years. I do actually give like emergency medicine some credit for that because I think going into training, you are kind of taught how to deal with anything that's coming at you. You're taught to think quickly on your feet at all times when there's a STEMI in front of you or if there's, gunshot wound patient in front of you. No matter what, you have to be okay with it and you have to just deal with it and, process it later, but deal with it in the second. So I think a part of it went to how I dealt with my career and everything that I learned through emergency medicine. So, ER doctors are pretty awesome. So part of it, but then I'm like, was it my personality and, those characteristics that got me into emergency medicine in the first place? Like, I'm not sure. So I don't know. I think I have the mindset of, generally speaking, like worrying about something isn't necessarily gonna make it go away. It doesn't mean you shouldn't worry because a little bit of worry is healthy, but being angry and being worried and overthinking things isn't going to change the fact that you are going through this. So it's much better to just kind of deal with it in the moment and then either change it or do something about it and move on. I also find the fact that you don't have to dwell on everything, but I don't know, like some people are like, you have to think and do that. Like I'm like, no, just like think about it in the moment, do this and like move on. So that's just kind of the way that I've led my life so far. I don't know how I'm going to feel in 10, 20 years, but that's how I did it. And in general, I tend to be a realist. I'm a little bit, obviously people say I'm positive. I'm like, I don't think I'm positive necessarily, but I have a good attitude towards things. And I think that helps me. Like, even if something was going poorly, I try to at least see the good things out of it, the good things that were coming out of it. Like, for example, I'm like, okay, everything that I went through really sucked, but like, at least like, look at all these like organ donors that signed up because of it. So I saw it like that. And in general in life, like, since I was younger, that's kind of how apparently I've seen things, as my parents put it. So if you can flip things around and see it like that, then I think that helps too.
Thank you. Yeah, I find that perspective very helpful. I don't know if my fellow internists on the line feel the same way, but I guess we're used to things are not ruled out until they're ruled out and thinking about the details. And so, yeah, I really, I think it's contributed to my wellness in the past few days.
I would ask one more question.
Sure.
And I think that this is what, for me, as someone who's becoming more and more of a public voice, and you sort of think about like how much of your own, story do you want to share, and you become vulnerable. And so I just like wanted to hear about like, when you decided to pull the trigger and let the world know about this. And did you ever like kind of look back and say, man, why am I doing this? This is not a good idea. Or is it just like, this is a great idea, it's going so well, I'm going to continue? Like, tell us about that. 'Cause I think that transition is scary. And like, and probably we could, being a little vulnerable helps in making whatever you're talking about more impactful. So I want to hear about that, and sort of maybe someone on this call is on the verge of doing this exact same thing that you're doing.
Yeah, of course. I'm going to be honest with you. Like, I wasn't thinking. I didn't think it would get this big. I was just kind of like, I had a heart transplant. And when I wrote the blog, I started writing the blog when I was still hospitalized. And I remember initially it was just like and it wasn't that I didn't want it to be public. I initially just did it for my friends and my family and, whoever was following me on like Facebook and Twitter or whatever, because I just got so many texts all the time. I literally, at one point, I woke up from my heart transplant surgery. I think I had over 300 texts, and I was like, I'm like on a fentanyl drip. Like I can't respond to all these.
There was a way to answer all these texts quickly.
So initially, my point with the blog was just to get my story out there. And then when it started getting really popular, and then, when I got the story out there, I was like, and I really want to I had all these ideas. I think I was also on like, 2,000 grams of Solumedrol or whatever it is that they give. So I think I had like a lot of energy. And so I was like, and while I'm at it, like, why don't I do this fundraiser for Donate Life America? And while I'm at it, like, so I kept adding things to it without really thinking. And then like within a couple of weeks, it got really popular. So, and I haven't regretted it. But there are people who ask me this and I'm like, should I have not done it? Like, so I don't know if I think it's just a more like, I've always been very open on social media in general. Like I've always had like Instagram and Twitter and Facebook, and I've been open about a lot of things. And I think it's a personal choice. There are people who are not as open. Like, for example, in the physician transplant group, actually, most of the physicians who are in that group aren't open about their transplants, and that's their choice. But I do find it very liberating to just be able to just say everything. I feel like it makes it so much easier. I don't have to hide anything. Everybody just people at the hospital will like stop me to take a picture with me, which is like, like, aren't you like the girl from Twitter? I'm like, yeah.
Getting selfies while rounding.
So I find it very liberating, and it was a way for me to not only process everything that I went through, and then other people benefit from it, because I got all these like messages saying like, oh my God, I went through what you went through. And I was like, oh, that's another thing that came out of it. So many good things came out of the blog that like, there's no way I could regret it. Like I love it so much. So, but again, that's just me. I think all of us are, but I encourage people, if they're okay with it, to put their stories out there. So far, it hasn't impacted me negatively. Of course, like there's like hate messages here and there, but I think that comes with anything. But other than that, I think it's been beautiful, like being able to connect with people through it, and it's just been liberating, and it's a nice way to express myself and just get the word out about organ donation. So
there's one other thing we didn't talk about, and I think while this was all happening, was the hospital you're training in closed down?
Oh, yeah.
And how did that kind of work through? I mean, that was a big story and got a lot of social media attention. And what was it? What's the story behind that, and how that impacted you during all this?
Okay, so I have a very dark sense of humor, and I was like, of course, like I go back, like literally the day, because I went back on July 1st. I went back a couple weeks before July 1st, and the day, like literally the day that I went back was the day that they told everybody that it was shutting. Like they're like, all right, we're
so the day you came back to work after a heart transplant.
Yeah, it was
you were in that ER. They sort of stabilized you, got you to pen, and then you got transplanted, and then you're excited, and you come back, and then how did you hear about it?
We got an email. I was actually doing an admin block because I couldn't go straight into clinical that first month back into like going back to residency. I was going to do admin in my residency because I didn't want to see patients like immediately. And so I was in my program director's office, like helping him with some stuff. And then we got an email, and it basically was like, we're going to be shutting the hospital down, like look out for more emails. And I was like, are you serious? But there's like this really beautiful moment that I'll never forget. It was raining that day. It was like June gloom. So it started raining, and I remember I didn't take an umbrella with me because I hate umbrellas, and I never take umbrellas with me anywhere. And so I ended up like walking home in the rain, and I was like drenched by the time I got back to my apartment. And I was like kind of sad too. So I was like wet and sad. And then I like got in my apartment and I was laughing at one point, and I was like, you know what though? Like, it's okay. Like, I'm here and this is such like a human moment for me. Like I'm able to feel these things and that's so much better than being dead. Like that's really how I thought because, you know, I would have been dead otherwise. So I specifically remember feeling so, I know this sounds cheesy, but feeling really alive when that all happened. And it was nice.
Were you able to complete your training, or do you have to do something somewhere else to finish and then move on to your fellowship?
I had to find a new residency program that basically took me in for the last few months. So I finished my residency at UPMC Harrisburg, which was UPMC Pinnacle, which was in Harrisburg.
And your friends, colleagues, I'm sure there's a lot. I mean, there's, from what we saw on social media,
Yeah,
a lot of really bad things happened.
Yeah, so American Academic had basically bought the hospital a year beforehand. And initially they told us that the New Yorker did a really good article on this recently. They had bought the hospital and initially told us that they were here to help us out, do all these things. Also keep in mind that like around the time that they bought the hospital and were making some changes, that's when all the health stuff happened to me. So I wasn't sure of all these changes. But lo and behold, instead, the CEO and this whole company basically just decide to sell the hospital without telling any, like there was no plan. Now, the GME office, the education office, and our program directors were very good about trying to help us find places, but I mean, it was still difficult. That, you know, it was still really difficult to find places. So 540 residents total. We all had to kind of scramble to find a spot. You know, the things that you don't know about medicine is that with residents come, you know, there's funds that come with us. Depending on which year you are, you have a certain number of dollars that come with you. So there were certain hospitals that were only taking like, I guess, you know, there's all these like politics that go into it, but basically like some hospitals wanted only first years, or actually most hospitals were okay with all the interns, but it was really difficult getting a spot as like second year or third year, because not everybody wanted second years or third years. And then, yeah, so it was just very difficult scrambling into a spot, especially me. Like I just needed a few more months. So I had to find like anything. And I had to find a place, like my main issue was I need to find health insurance because I need a cath once a week. I honestly just need a place where I could do my cath, like, you know.
And just to be clear, it's Hahnemann Hospital in Philadelphia that we're referring to that closed down. And, you know, it's just really remarkable that it, you know, outside of a heart transplant and everything that you've gone through, and then to have this happen and you sort of take it in stride is pretty incredible. I'm curious to know, like, you know, with your attitude the way it is now, like if all this didn't happen and then this happened, what your response would have been? Anger, or looks like maybe this helped you sort of realize the most important things in life are really your health.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really your health. And I recently wrote a blog post about this, but I think I always try to tell people like there's one really important thing that came out of it. And there's no way to put this because you're never going to understand this unless you like go through this. And I tell people this, but really your life can change in a second. And I know I can say that, everybody could say that. But you're never going to understand that. And like, you really won't understand that unless you go through it. And once you meet that point where everything is taken away from you for 1 second and you know what that feels like, and then you're given a chance to have it all back, you kind of see the stuff that really matters, and you see how much people care about that like doesn't really matter. And again, it's something that you just don't understand until usually it's just too late. But I try to tell people, and I'm at the end, I'm like, it's so hard to put into words.
Well, we can definitely hear the joy that you have in life now, and that is inspiring in and of itself. So thank you so much for coming. I'm just thrilled. I remember reading your blog from probably the first few days, and you know, spread pretty quickly on social media. And you know, occasionally you do think that. You think like, man, you get to a car accident or, you know, something can happen, but you really lived it. And thank you for telling your story. And I think we will close there.
Thank you. This was outstanding. We really appreciate you coming here. This is awesome.
Thank you so much.